Hamas is the governing party of a major nation state with serious global ambitions. Yeah, all right, fascinating. I would think if we're going to talk about publicly broadcasted atrocities, that Israeli soldier TikTok videos are relevant here. But
well, that's how the Israel is similar. So there's similarities and differences going across. Yeah.
Maybe everybody's the Nazis. I don't know. This is the whole thing. It's like remember after the LA live show, I think the next day, I had lunch with producer Jordan and C. Derick Varn, who's about to join us, and Deep State Cuba. And we were talking about this with regard to Ukraine, that like the sort of dominant narrative, of both sides is that this is World War II. They just disagree on who's who, and like one of Putin's excuses for the invasion was denazification. But then, of course, there are all of these like Ukraine hawks in the West say, oh, if we had any kind of negotiated settlement, that would be just like Munich, or, this is World War II in the other direction. And I remember Cuba commented that, like you almost wonder if this is like the importance of these narratives is so significant that this could be part of military strategy. Like, oh, we can't kill too many of the Azov guys, because if there are still a bunch of Wagner Group guys left, this was back when that was still a thing, then we'll have a Nazi gap, right? They'll have more Nazis than we do. And, we'll have lost the narrative battle. I actually think it's possible that not everything is World War II, that in fact, most things aren't World War II. Sometimes other stuff happens, but that's me. But of course, so Aidan, who is a UCLA philosophy major, reached out about interning on the show over the summer. I know has been very involved in the Palestine protests there. If you want to give us a little bit of background on this.
Right. So, well, go to UCLA, transferred in this year. Once the encampment started, I was part of it from the beginning. It started out just like a small patch of grass in the main quad at UCLA, and then it expanded and expanded. And as it expanded, things got more and more tense. There was a little screen, or a big screen really, built that would display just all sorts of grotesque imagery. They'd play music that was played for Palestinian prisoners as they were tortured and killed. And by Sunday, which was like the fourth or fifth day, they had a big pro-Israel rally, and nothing really happened that day. Monday, people came at night, and it got a little bit more tense, a little bit more riled up. But again, it just kind of sizzled out by like 1 or 2 in the morning. And then Tuesday night, which is what everyone's probably seen at this point, because I think it was Columbia and UCLA that had like the most, probably the most publicized protests. Columbia because of the crackdown, and at UCLA because of what happened Tuesday night. By Tuesday night, the same people came as the night before, but there was about 200 or 300 of them instead of 30 or 40. And so, as things began to escalate, we have a video for it right here. At first, it was like some water bottles were thrown. I think a firecracker was thrown, and something actually caught fire, but it was put out pretty quickly, thankfully. A bag of mice was thrown into the encampment, and then it just escalated and escalated and escalated. And the whole time, I was a bag of mice. Yeah. And actually, look, this is a bit of a conspiracy theory. On all the mice, there was a little dot on top of them in the same exact place. So some people were theorizing that maybe they were injected with something.
Okay,
or something. We had to bag up all the.
Be careful about that. But yeah, it's bizarre one way or the other.
I'm not making up that conspiracy theory. But it was strange that all the mice had a dot in the same exact place. But anyways, that's just some people were just theorizing about that. But still, crazy that a bag of mice was thrown into the encampment. Tuesday night, as things got more and more intense. They began to shoot pepper spray at us, and there was batteries. I still have a little nick right here from a battery that was thrown in my eye. At one point, we were trying to keep the barriers in place, and they kind of dragged the barrier out, and all of a sudden I was surrounded by 8 or 9 of these pro-Israel protesters. And, you know, I got maced. There was some batteries thrown. I got nicked in the eye, as I said. And one thing that happened was I got slashed in the arm by what I didn't know what. And the next day, I saw a doctor about it. And they were like, yeah, you got stabbed by a metal rod. And also it's infected. And also you need stitches. So, but that wasn't even the worst of it. You know, people were getting, the worst thing I probably saw was this girl, looked like 1920. She was out there trying to keep the encampment in place. Some guy came up to her and knocked her in the face, and she fell back. And that was one of the most. It was definitely. I mean, in my life, I don't think I've ever seen like such a grotesque grotesque violence. At least, certainly not in person. So yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah, let's got the video of here.
Yeah, so this will set it up, and then we have some stuff that Aidan took himself.
This is the worst violence of any of the ongoing college protests. UCLA, where counter-protesters used sticks and boards against a pro-Palestine encampment. It was more than 3 hours of unrestrained violence the night of April 30th. Led to injuries and bloody scenes as campus security and law enforcement allowed it to continue.
Yeah, so you were telling us the other day, and that you had like a little bit of insight about the law enforcement part of this, that this was really a UCLA decision.
Right. So we've heard varying stories, but when we like the Chancellor Gene Block went to Congress and said that it was unfortunate that the police didn't respond. But the actual way it works is that, well, California is a state school. The LAPD and the LAPD and the sheriffs, which is like the LAPD is obviously local. The sheriffs are like
County.
They're like by the county, right? And so the police that have to respond are the CHP, which is the California Highway Patrol. And when they were initially called, they have to get approval from the school in order to actually do anything, because the UCPD, which is like the University of California Police Department, has jurisdiction. If the CHP, which is the state police, if they want to actually intervene with, you know, their riot gear and they're obviously because of the state police, they basically have superior gear to actually deal with things like this, like riots like this. So the school has to approve them. So they showed up 2 hours late. No idea why that happened. And then they stayed there for about 3 or 4 hours watching. And what we found out later was that the school didn't approve them interfering with what actually happened until about 3 or 4 in the morning. And so Gene Block, and this was confirmed by the Vice Chancellor, was actually watching from Royce Hall, which is a big, it's a big like school building right by the quad, and it's like 4 or 5 or 6 stories. He was watching from a vantage point as this all happened, and and the police were still delayed, 3 or 4 hours as he was watching his own students be attacked by people who came from Beverly Hills or from like other parts of LA.
You mean like outside agitators? In other words,
outside agitators who came and they were attacking his students, and yeah, he didn't do anything about that.
Yeah, no, it's honestly amazing. I mean, you think about like any other, like, look, if this were like if this had been like 4 years ago and it was like a BLM protest that like have the equivalent amount of rule breaking, have the put in some tents for overnight campaign, right? Like, and you had like you had a bunch of people, you had the equivalent like violence directed against it by just sort of a random mob of politically unsympathetic people. This would have been in like Biden campaign ads. Like this would have been a very, very big deal. I mean, right. Like we'd be talking about this, like, Charlottesville, I mean, like obviously somebody died there, although there was a car that was driven into some Columbia protesters by a member of the extended Kahan family, even, which is pretty close parallel there. But like this would have been really, really scandalous stuff. But like even I mean, just the general, I mean, I know a million people have made this point, but I mean, just the general portrayal of this is like, oh, violence breaks out, right? I mean, it's like the most like studiously neutral way that you could possibly put it.
Yeah. And also, have you guys heard too? Maybe it's just the one weirdo that I know. I've seen a lot of propaganda. Like, ever notice why the pro-Hamas protest all like turn violent inevitably, while Zionist protests never do? Which is, I mean, which, even to be fair to CNN, which I did appreciate that, right in the voiceover, she says that this is by far the most violence to break out, any of these protests. Now, all of this stuff is kind of like doesn't directly address, the genocide that's going on in Palestine, but it does kind of speak to the ridiculousness of some of the Zionist propaganda. You know what I mean? It's obviously not the case that like one side has a monopoly on violence, and if anything, it mirrors what's going on with the one side that does have, is doing the lion's share of the damage, like, trying to deflect blame. So yeah, but it's good to have a correspondent who is actually in there putting himself on the line. So so we welcome Aidan to the show. I want to spend the other day, the production meeting, all of a sudden there was just like a younger, healthier guy that Ben introduced as the new intern. I'm like, what is, I gotta step up. But
yeah, gonna get Jake his gold watch. That's
No, the last thing I'd say is to initiate Aidan, because I know we gotta move on, is that we have a long-standing tradition that Ben just will blame me for any mishap that goes wrong, kind of like Jimmy Dore, right? Like the producer is just like always at fault. So now I'm just gonna pass it down. If anything goes wrong, it's Aidan's fault.
Like the Simpsons, is the Tibor fucked up again.
yeah, exactly. But no, welcome to the show.
Yeah,
Aidan.
fair enough. And we do, I know, have a clip that Aidan himself recorded from the protest, if we want to just do that quickly before we move on.
Yeah, this goes into some like kind of a supercut, and it starts off with Aidan's own footage.
Halfway through the quad. Look at this. Somebody is being beaten. Somebody is being beaten with...
So you could see some of Aidan's own footage kind of going into what was like a super cut. But yeah, that was like another vantage point. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, really appreciate it. You can now have all of the riches and social status that are associated with involvement in mid-tier leftist podcasts. So just, I don't know, try not to let it go to your head. But in any case, I will see Jake, at least I know, in the post game. Aidan, if you are able to join us back then, certainly feel free. But for now, I will say goodbye to you guys, and we will bring on C. Derick Varn of Varn Vlog, and Matt McManus of Jacobin Edgelords, Academic Edgelords, Commonweal. I don't know. If you have if you just open a piece of printed matter at random, bibliomancy style, you'll probably run into a Matt McManus article there.
At least like some fucking like barcode that I've worked on in the past or something.
Okay, fair enough. How you guys doing?
Good, yeah. Fucking,
I'm okay.
Fair enough. Well, yeah. So I thought that when I saw that Tucker Carlson had interviewed Aleksandr Dugin on his show, I knew that this was so obviously GTAA content that that an episode about it sooner or later was inevitable. It was determined by the nature of the thing itself. But I thought you guys would both be really interesting people to have on, because you know, I know, you know, I mean, certainly Matt has written about Dugin, and you know, I know I've seen Varn produce Dugin content. I think you guys are in you know, the very small circle of Anglophone people who, for better or worse, have actually read some of his books. So that's so yeah, I thought you might have some insight here. So I mean, if somebody want to kind of get us started with you know, who this guy is exactly.
You want to go, Matt, or do you want me to go?
You can go, Derek. You know,
Aleksandr Dugin is a Russian political philosopher who way long ago had a post at the University of Moscow. Kind of fell briefly out of favor in 2013, 2014 for basically calling for total war on Ukraine and like nuking them. He had been introduced to the United States before in the context of radical traditionalism, of which he was a member in the aughts, tied up to the foundation of the National Bolshevik Party in Russia with Edward Lemonov and those fun groups of artistically inclined coffeehouse Nazis.
everyone's favorites.
Yeah, everyone's favorite kind of Nazi.
Yeah, I really should say that you two are in the very small circle. Like
Mhm.
the first circle is small, but you're in the very small circle of English speakers who've read some of Dugin's books who aren't like incredibly off-putting fascist weirdos.
It's like, yeah. So there's a shift in Dugin's thinking in the late aughts where he starts developing his own theory, moving himself away from National Bolshevism and tying in some of his other theories. He'd also converted to Orthodox Christianity sometime in that interim. I'm not sure when that happened, but it's important for his late aughts work. And he developed something that can be rightly construed as a kind of synthesis of post-Marxism and post-fascism that he calls fourth position, or you know, the fourth position theory. Doesn't make a big hay in the U.S. at first. It's not translate. It comes out in Russian in 2009. It takes about 3 years to get into English. It's published in English first by Mark Shabobda by himself in this kind of like bootleg copy. Then Shabobda and the American academic Mark Milliman revised that and released a kind of official version from Arctos Press. Arctos Press is itself weird. It's kind of like it is a European New Right and New Right adjacent press. So we might also call it fascist and post-fascist, but it was tied up in the radical traditionalist movement. Dugin is kind of an influential thinker in Russia. Although when I talk to Russians about this, I get wildly different positions about how influential he is. Most Russians seem to think he's a joke. Some people tell me actually he's serious, but he's not for internal consumption. He's actually for non-Russians, and that's his ideological function. I don't know what to make of that. I can tell you that the rhetoric that Putin uses resembles Dugin's rhetoric now more than it has in the past. But that does not necessarily mean that like Dugin's had a whole lot of influence on Putin. It could be that this is just trends in Eurasianism that aren't getting translated into English except in people that we see like Dugin. So anyway, he loses his position at University of Moscow, kind of becomes a media figure. And around this time in the West, a bunch of liberals discover him and kind of posit him as Putin's Rasputin, which is a real big misunderstanding. He was never that. It's hard to say what he is, but this idea that he's really somehow the secret brain of Putin is highly misleading. The secret brain of Putin would not have gone on Alex Jones's show. So it's he sets himself up as a media figure and kind of becomes a boogeyman for liberals And while there have been attempted outreach to Marxists and other left-wing thinkers as early as 2012, I mean, it's in his book that like he thinks that they should try to reincorporate parts of Marxism literally as a Sorelian myth to establish a fifth column on the left. And he says this explicitly. That is not me like impugning motives. It's directly in the second chapter of Fourth Political Theory. He becomes a higher, like you start seeing his particular use of Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr's conception of multipolarity, that was also in vogue, and I think people forget this, in liberal circles around the time of the centrist liberal critique of the Bush administration, a la Fareed Zakaria. And Dugin was originally like in dialogue with that when he wrote the book in Russian, but it came back up around 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. After the failure of the Bernie campaign, you start seeing this kind of rhetoric being picked up by patriotic socialists and other dissident factions of the left. So Dugin's an interesting problem in that he kind of represents an explicit attempt to build what we might call a post-red-brown alliance. It's hard to really categorize. He also got more fame when his daughter was blown up by accident. Clearly, the bomb seemed aimed at him. Clearly seemed like Ukrainians were out, to get him for reasons that kind of make sense given some of the things he said about Ukraine. This also led to some people positing him as some kind of weird anti-fascist. I've seen that, which is bizarre given that he's explicitly endorsed national Bolshevik parties in Europe. Like not even like in code, like he's endorsed Casa Pound and he's endorsed Golden Dawn. Like it's not even hidden. And so he's an interesting figure right now. For me, and I guess I'll let Matt speak. It's hard for me to figure out if he's just a weirdo that we're distracted by on the left, or if he's actually a serious representation of Russian reaction at this moment. And I think that's actually an open question. The other thing I'll say is while he's an irrationalist, and I think that will become very clear as we talk tonight, he is not stupid. And a lot of people underplay him as I've seen him like compared to like Russia's Alex Jones. He is not that dumb. And that has to be dealt with. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt now for any additional comments.
Yeah, I thought that was great. So my take on the guy is primarily influenced by Charles Clover's book, Black Wind, White Snow, The Rise of Russia's New Right, and a few other sources as well, including, Michael Millerman's book, because Michael Millerman was one of the most important figures on the American right who tried to popularize him for an English-speaking audience. But the way Clover tells it through a lot of biographical ruminations and interviews with different people on the Russian right, Dugin, when he was a young upper middle class person or a kid in the Soviet Union, generally speaking, was very anti-communist, as many people were, right? And consequently, he toiled around with a lot of different, what we might call kind of punk fascist aesthetics, embracing things, again, like National Bolshevism and toying around with fascist imagery. But like a lot of young Russians, when the Soviet Union did actually fall, he was pretty horrified and aghast at that. Not so much because he had a great deal of nostalgia for the communist regime, let alone socialism or Marxism or what it happens to be, but because the Soviet Union was at least a major world power that he identified with. And now that was gone. And American imperialism and American capitalism and liberalism seem to be the only game in town. And we're all familiar, I think, with the end of history period, right?
Yeah. And also, to be fair, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union really was like pretty apocalyptic for the perspective of people who lived there, right? Like that that you had wars, civil wars, economic breakdown, breakdown of sort of basic public safety, this huge decline in life expectancy, people would like all these, would go like months without getting paid, rise of, organized crime to the point of kind of merging with the state, right? I mean, like it was a whole like
kind of merging with the state. I would not even say kind of, but go ahead.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, it was a whole dystopian movie that played out there, over the course of the 90s.
Oh yeah, and that's exactly what Clover points out, right? And in one of the most telling quotes that he cites from Dugin very on in his career, Dugin apparently says that he never realized that he loved the Soviet Union until it was gone, right? Again, not so much because of communism, but because of being, a major hegemonic superpower that was a rival to the United States. And interestingly enough, what happened, as you pointed out, was the country descended immediately into chaos against all the expectations of those who figured if you just introduce absolute free markets immediately into the former Soviet system, Valhalla will just emerge, right? And the Russian military in particular, at least on Clover's telling, were the ones who first took an interest in him, not because they thought he was anything special per se, but because there was this real anxiety on the part of the Russian military about what they were now supposed to stand for, right? They weren't trying to advance the cause of worldwide communism any longer. Going back to kind of Tsarism didn't seem exactly possible. And they felt like, well, there's all these kind of weirdo nationalists and far-right people and cranks and liberals. Let's just give them all a little bit of money and a little bit of leeway. And we'll try everything, right? And see who can come up with an ideology that can speak to these times. And so this is where you start to see Dugin work really hard on his first really big book, Foundations of Geopolitics, where he lays out a case that actually it's now Russia's destiny to be part of this grand Eurasian civilization that's for the most part going to be committed to hard right principles. There's also a bunch of stuff, that draws upon, early 20th century geopolitics, nations of the sea versus nations of the land. The idea being that nations of the land, like the United States, sea, like the United States, are more inclined towards liberalism and cosmopolitanism, whereas countries like Russia that are countries of the land are more grounded in the soil and more religious and less liberal. And long story short, the idea was, all the different, Eurasian nations will gather together under Russia's leadership. They'll confront American imperial power. The nations of the land will overcome the nations of the sea. And then quite literally in some very colorful passages in Foundations of Geopolitics, he says all of his enemies will burn in hell as Russia regains its rightful place at the apex of the world. Because as Derek will tell you, revenge fantasies are pretty much a constant theme in any kind of fascist or post-fascist or neo-fascist discourse, right? There's always got to be revenge of some sort. And as Derek pointed out, it's ambivalent what the reception of this book was in Russia. It was a bestseller, sold very well, and apparently some people were quite taken with it. But it's not clear how much the Russian military or the emerging regime saw him as kind of a useful idiot, spouting something that was helpful in justifying Russian resurgence, or how much they really bought into what he was saying ideologically and thought there was some tenability to it. And for a while there, he kind of occupies a variety of different positions in the Russian regime, between being a kind of public-facing intellectual, producing things that range from intellectually highfalutin material to outright conspiracy theories, lecturing in a variety of different capacities on Eurasianism. And his next main work, as Derek points out, the one that really makes his name, certainly in the West, is this book, The Fourth Political Theory. And this is the one where he steps away from some of the more overt fascist rhetoric and new right rhetoric of people like Guillaume Fay or Alain de Benoit, and posits the idea that the three major political theories of the 20th century, fascism, communism, and liberalism, have all failed. So it's necessary is a new political theory, this fourth political theory. Now, anybody who reads this book will come away with two conclusions. First off is that, as Derek said, he's not a stupid guy, right? He's very well read. He's certainly knowledgeable about a wide array of different figures, including, on the far right and even postmodern authors and from French post-structuralism. But he is definitely not concerned with what we might call intellectual consistency, right?
At all,
right? He's very much like a lot of fascists, right? Where he's more concerned with the syncretic effective appeal of what he's piecing together, and very overt about that, right?
Yeah,
where he says,
I remember like 5 years ago on TMBS, one of the times I was on in person, I said something about fascism not being an intellectual theory, and there were people who were like mad or thought that was wrong because like they thought I was denying that there are fascist intellectuals, which obviously there are. I was like, yeah, that's not my point, right? Like, this isn't like the role of a fascist intellectual is to sort of like do their best to rationalize stuff that grows out of other sources, right? I mean, this is like Marxism, ironically, has a much better claim to be like something that starts out as an intellectual current and sort of comes into the world, even though that's not how Marxists think it should work exactly. But like but I mean, fascism is just not, is just not like that, right? I mean, that this is, you have people with varying degrees of coherence who sort of try to do their best to sort of make intellectual sense of something that obviously doesn't come from there and tends to be pretty incoherent.
Oh, absolutely, right. And this is what you really get from the fourth political theory, right? Where it self-consciously draws from an enormous and eclectic array of sources to kind of stitch together this pastiche of a theory that he imagines will be appealing to a large number of people who ideologically might not have a lot of common together, but they all share a certain kind of resentment towards Western liberalism and Americanism in particular. So, and he's pretty overt about the fact that even though this is posited as a fourth political theory, the road from the third political theory, fascism, to the fourth political theory is a lot shorter and a lot wider than the road from liberalism or communism, right? From communism, he mostly just says, we're going to take a bit of anti-capitalism because, market libertinism is really bad, and we also don't want to be materialists in the way that Marx was. But, there's certain kinds of critiques of culture that are useful there. From liberalism, he doesn't really want to take much of anything beyond this vague reference to freedom, so-called, except freedom now redefined in his own particular way.
Freedom for like... I mean, he takes it. He actually does take this weird stance on race that like takes something like DEI but applies it to all ideas. So any idea, according to him, that assumes supremacy on an unsupported ground is inherently racist, even if it's not about race. Which I laughed because like, oh, this sounds like Abraham X. Kendi, but like for fascist.
Right.
So it's he uses a lot of this stuff. Again, and also if you read the Foundations of Geopolitics versus what he says in fourth political theory, he's a pluralist for everything but America. Like everybody's okay except for the United States, although weirdly he wants to fragment Europe and unite Eurasia, which if you just think about that from geopolitical arrangements, so he wants to weaken his neighbor to the west significantly by dividing it up into national projects, which could either be incorporated or not, but at least not pose a threat to a Eurasian superstate. The other thing that's like kind of left out of the Eurasianism stuff is like, is China part of it or not? And that's always left very ambiguous because the Chinese project and his project are only united in that they are theoretically and superficially, although within market limits, quite frankly, opposed to the United States in a way that like Russia has to be because of sanctions now. But that's interesting. And there's this question, I think, in a lot of the stuff in fourth political theory is how sincere he is. One of the things I'll tell you is reading his work on what he claims that the flaw of the third political theory is its racism. Now, we've already noted that he redefined racism, but also like he knows damn well that not all fascists are Nazi racialists. And in fact, he obscures that fact. And he then will quote actual fascists, but say they are like conservative revolutionaries or misidentify their actual political tradition. Like he says, Carl Smith, the conservative revolutionary. Carl Smith's not a conservative revolutionary. He's a fascist jurist. Like conservative revolutionaries, for those you don't know, were people like Ernst Jünger and a lot of the
Oswald Spengler,
those guys. Like they were like national socialists, but they tended to hate the Nazis, like for a variety of reasons.
Mostly because Spengler thought they were too plebeian a movement, right?
Right.
The problem wasn't national socialism in the sense that we want Germany über alles and a dictatorship. It's that Hitler was too crude and too demonic for his days,
and also too racial, like they too biologically modernist, in that their racism was not like was biological, like because Spengler was like, well, like a Jew can become a German, like they just embrace the spirit of Germanness in their and then they're a good German. Like Spengler had no problem with that. He was a national chauvinist, absolutely, but he wasn't a biological racist. And you see this a lot in Dugin. And I want to point out like kind of why. There's two things we have to mention. One, to be a fascist is still, or a Nazi, not necessarily a fascist, is still technically illegal in Russia, right? It is against the law. And two, Russia's not a racially unified polity and never has been. So like European white nationalism it has some cachet among street hoodlums in St. Petersburg, but it has very little cachet to the Russian government because it would divide up the country immediately. So
he's also aware of the fact that any kind of international coalition that could potentially be strong enough to take on the United States is probably going to have to include countries like Iran, for example, as one that he's usually pretty willing to flirt with a little bit, or countries like North Korea, and as Derek said, sometimes China as well, right? So that kind of militant racism isn't something that he's biological racism, I should say, something that he's willing to flirt with. Although he does point out sometimes that he's comfortable with things like Evola's spiritual racism, right? This idea of ranking cultures and ranking different kind of regions of the world. I think like the one thing that we should do before we dive into this interview is answer that question that Derek brought up of whether or not he's a fascist intellectual, because it is actually a recurring problem for a lot of people. I
tend to think so. I mean, I've got, and as you know, right, I'm somebody who's.
What do you say? Like if the jackboot fits, right?
Yeah, exactly. If the jackboot fits. I think that's literally what I said last time we talked about it. Yeah. I mean, look, as you know, I'm somebody who tends to be extremely wary of the overuse of the F word. Not fuck, that's fine, but fascism. I think I wrote an essay about this that, the stream I did with Stefan yesterday, we were talking about it. That's fascism and conceptual analysis, where I was giving people a hard time about like sort of throwing it around with like horrendously unclear definition and very little interest in trying to clear up the definition they're using, and I think it's sort of ultimately kind of unhelpful, and it tends to have diminishing people use it to sort of like in an attempt to like attach some emotional power, get people excited about opposing things. But I think that strategy tends to have real diminishing returns over time, right? If everything's fascist, then, then it's sort of hard to care as much about it.
What's really fascist, Ben? You policing people's use of the word fascism. I can't think of anything that's more fascist.
That itself is fascist. Yeah, no,
essentially fascist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that and in general, I just think it's like not a great sign if we have to always compare everything to the interwar European bad thing to get excited about opposing it. Some things are bad, but not fascist. But all that said, I actually think in this case it does seem to fit. I don't see like it seems like what he's, you could say like, okay, he's not like hooked up to like an actually existing sort of effective. I mean, he's certainly hooked up to fascist groups and other thinkers and stuff like that, but like certainly not like an effective fascist movement that could, it's in a position to take state power. But I mean, like in terms of his own views, it's like, yeah, it does seem like a fascist to me. Like I'm pretty comfortable using the term here. I mean, Varn and I watched like a couple years ago, I think, his debate with Bernard-Henri Lévy, real.
Which he spanked, I may add. He beat, I mean, as much as I hate it, he beat Lévy bad.
No question. Yeah. I mean, balls and strikes here. Dugin definitely did a better job than Lévy in that debate. But in that debate, I mean, one, it's funny you mentioned the thing about liberalism and freedom, but he actually took the position explicitly that people don't have rights, like individual human beings don't have rights against their nations any more than the limbs of your body have rights against the rest of your body. That's like almost a quote. And he said, And like his answer to the fascism question was it essentially to say that he rejected fascism from the right, like he said his objection to fascism was that it was like a phenomenon of the modern world, right?
Yeah,
So,
Evola said the same thing, right? Fascism was too demonic, too, of the people. What he wanted was a kind of super fascism. So my view about this is it is appropriate to characterize Dugin as a fascist, and there are three reasons for this, right? The first is that this kind of syncretic myth making that Dugin specializes in, and that he is adept at, like as you point out very clearly, right, is again very, very, very typical of fascist intellectuals, whether we're thinking about people like Evola or even people like Mussolini, right? Mussolini was once pressed on the realism of fascist myth making. And in a kind of Nietzschean Sorelian vein, Mussolini, this is in the 1920s, just said, I don't really care, right? Is it a myth? Sure. It's an edifying myth. It elevates people, right? That's what matters, not the intellectual cogency of this idea of restoring Italy into the Roman Empire, right? The more important reasons, though, are that he shares a lot of fascism's affirmations and negations, right? Fascists historically, have been anti-feminist, anti-communist, certainly anti-liberal, and anti-democratic. And he shares all those predilections, right, to a T. But in terms of their affirmations, this is probably even the more important thing. So I tend to accept Griffin's definition, shorthand definition of fascism as palingenetic ultranationalism, right? This idea of national renewal of a nation that has been decayed by external and internal enemies. And that's what required is a populist right-wing party with authoritarian inclinations to transcend caste conflict and bring the nation back to its glory days. And that's been Dugin's stock and trade since the 1990s, right? When he was writing Foundations of Geopolitics. The basic through line of his work is Russia is a special country. There, but for the presence of the United States and liberal imperialism, it would rightly rule the world. But those nasty American imperialists keep getting in the way. And so what needs to happen is the right political group needs to get to power in Russia. It needs to dispel Western liberal ideas of democracy and citizen involvement, while at the same time exciting the people, or the Narod, as he sometimes calls them, and then it'll form this Eurasian alliance with a variety of different white nationalist, anti-liberal groups, and they'll take the fight to the United States, and Russia will rule the world, right? As it should, in his opinion.
Yeah, anti-imperialism, awesome.
Yeah, well, and pretty quintessentially fascist.
I'm gonna sound like I'm splitting the baby, but sure. It very much depends on what you think are the relative vectors of what makes something essentially versus non-essentially fascist. And I tend to take Enzo Traverso's definition more than Griffin's. And in that scenario, you have elements of fascism. I'll tell you what they are: national renewal, corporatism. But national renewal is a little iffy in Dugin in that he actually is interested in civilizational renewal. He actually buys into fundamentally the Samuel Huntington framework of civilizations, as incoherent as that actually ultimately is. That's one of his notions. It's a little different from standard fascism. He's actually not particularly interested in mass mobilizations or like street troopers either. And that's a little different as well. Although he probably liked to valorize all of Russian society and also Islamist society, etc. One thing I will say, though, if people think he's an anti-imperialist, his use of multipolarity is knowingly advised in that he has an issue with warder-based empires, of which he links to capital and liberal development. He's not the first person to do it. Bordiga in the 1950s did the same thing. I was literally just reading it today. But he actually said that any dream of going back to the land-based notions of domination were delusional, that world trade is too important, and that you have to imagine a return to a prior civilizational norm than the modern world. And in that sense, that's another thing in which Dugin rhymes with fascism. To me, whether or not we call him fascist is kind of irrelevant.
Sure.
One thing I would say is he's definitely a fucking reactionary. There's no way around that. And he is an imperialist for his team. The Eurasian project is an imperial project. particularly when you consider that he doesn't just want to push the United States out of Europe or out of Eurasia or the quit encirclement. If you read the Foundations of Geopolitics and think that he didn't just reject that, he wants to wipe the United States off the map.
Yeah,
which is
again, there are passages in the book where quite literally it ends with "they will burn in hell," right? And you could read that as kind of being a joke, but it's also intended pretty seriously, right? That Russia's enemies need to be condemned to the flames. And again, we don't have to quibble too much about whether or not he's a fascist or post-fascist. I was influenced by this. Again, it's very, very typical kind of revenge fantasy of the sort that you see ubiquitously across the far right, right? This idea that, our enemies are decadent, weak, but also too strong. And in overcoming them, we will revive our civilization and potentially revive the world as well. So his anti-imperialism is eclectic in the sense that he's absolutely opposed to American imperialism because he feels that they're spreading libertine values across the globe that are having a corrosive effect on world civilization. But he sees Russia in many cases as having a kind of special role or special destiny to play at the epicenter of this new Eurasian coalition or Eurasian civilization that's clearly going to be a new Russian empire by any other name, right?
The focus on the Ruski Mir indicates that it's an imperial project. Like it's the unification of the Russian world, which for him would be, I guess, the Orthodox Christian world and the Slavic peoples, although he's not a pan-Slavist, in addition to, say, certain Shia and Buddhist elements that have historically been part of Russia. This is why he's not a Christian nationalist as such. He doesn't want to cut those people out of the Russian orbit because they're traditionally in it. So this leads to a kind of Orthodox Christian supremacy in Dugin, but he doesn't want to wipe out like Buddhist or any of that, or Islamist or any of that. In fact, one of the things that if you go out and dig into like competing visions of Islamism, let's say in Turkey, right? You'll find that like there are Eurasianists who are Turkish Eurasianists and like Odraganists, and they're like fighting Duginists who are more aligned to this vision of Eurasianism as Russia, and that like, the Orthodox Christians aren't really a threat to Islam, so we can team up with them against the great Satan, etc., etc., etc. And I will say that makes this a more complicated notion. For people who are responding that I'm saying that Dugin doesn't want to rule the world. No, I'm saying Dugin wants an empire, and he wants Russia to be the first amongst equals, and he also does not want the U.S. to be part of that world. But he doesn't actually seem to want Russia to actually conquer, like the way the Nazis wanted to do, the entire planet.
Although if we're interested, which is certainly relevant for comparisons to classical fascism, but if we're talking about imperialism and anti-imperialism, I mean, surely anybody who's dumb enough to accept Dugin's claim to be an anti-imperialist who, left-wing anti-imperialist should like for that reason. I mean, presumably the main imperialism they have in mind is U.S. imperialism, which doesn't take the form typically of that kind of Nazi, direct conquest and, annexation, right? I mean, it takes the form of, a sort of complicated global hegemony that, involves a lot of military force, but like, isn't that, right? And I mean, Dugin certainly advocates that. I mean, if nothing else, he's certainly a maximalist about the war in Ukraine, so
absolutely.
I mean, yes.
That brings me actually to a good point. So in his later book, Introduction to Eurasianism, he actually pulls some very fun bits of fudging on these points. So he calls for revolutions or revolutionary attitudes, right? Really, I'd say counter-revolutionary attitudes against existing regimes. But then he singles out the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine and says, well, no, that doesn't really count because the content of a revolution also matters in determining whether a revolution by this criteria, right? And that's important in understanding his contemporary attitudes towards the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? Because he really sees this as part of a kind of broader global struggle by Russia against the United States. So when people get weirded out by how fanatical he seems to be about a regional conflict in Eastern Europe, that's part of the reason why, right? I remember Derrick was talking about this earlier, right? Because this isn't just a regional conflict in a small part of Eastern Europe for him. This is really the kickoff of a kind of global imperialist struggle against the United States, whose first or at least primary front right now is the Ukraine. And this is a moment of Russia reasserting itself within its traditional boundaries as one of the major steps towards breaking down U.S. power in that region of the world. And that's why, when the Ukraine war began, he was Facebooking and tweeting out things like kill, 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 advance and go, 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 celebrating the renewing and purifying violence that was associated with that war. Now, I saw a lot of leftists who responded to this in a way that I thought was pretty gross by saying, well, he's opposed to American imperialism. American imperialism is bad. And, we made some serious mistakes by edging NATO ever closer to Russia's borders. So perhaps it's appropriate to respond this way.
You could say that I would say, right, that NATO expansion in the 90s was like a catastrophic overreach, and that's definitely part of the causal backstory of the conflict reaching this point. All of that stuff. Lots of people think I'm a Putin apologist because I want negotiated de-escalation. But it's also like fucking insane to say it's like he's an anti-imperialist. He's against American imperialism because he's a Russian imperialist. Like, of course, if you're a Russian imperialist, of course you're against American imperialism, right? I mean, if you're
exactly right.
If you're an Ohio State fan, right? Like that, then obviously you're against like the U of M football team. That doesn't mean you're against football.
Well, no. That's an actual instance of somebody just being evil and wrong, Ben, and they deserve to actually be condemned to hell. Your other examples, that's fine, but don't talk to me about Ohio State here.
Okay. Well, as the resident Marxist sectarian overlord, I find it interesting that so many Marxists have picked up multipolarity talk because its origins actually are an American-British neo-realism. Particularly of the Hans Morgenthau school, that thought that having a multipolar world would lead to more stability because there'd be less likelihood of direct nuclear conflict. This was also picked up by the British. I mentioned them, the British thinker H. Carr. That's where it comes from. It's an explicitly imperial thing, and in fact, their whole purpose was to do what actually did happen, which was to prompt some faction of the American policy establishment, in this case Nixon, to reach out to China to break it off into a third pole to weaken the Soviet Union. That was their explicit and stated goal. So,
yeah, and I should also add, geopolitics itself is a highly problematic discourse that has its roots in 19th century theories of imperialism, particularly in Germany, where many German theorists were amongst the first to posit that there's this distinction between the countries of the sea, like the United States, like the United Kingdom in particular, and the countries of the land, like Germany. And of course, they were not particularly neutral in their ruminations either, since their hypothesis was that the countries of the land, like Germany, should compete or outcompete at least the countries of the sea, and that would include outcompeting them ideologically by advancing things like German authoritarianism and love for the Kaiser across Europe. There was one last thing I wanted to bring up, since this is nominally a philosophy podcast and some people might be interested in this, which is his eclectic relationship with Western intellectuals, right? So Dugin's kind of recipe book, people that he's influenced by, grows bigger with each book he publishes, and so it's difficult to keep up. And again, this is kind of the syncretic dimension that I mentioned. A lot of these people are pretty typical nouvelle droit authors, Guillaume Fay, Alain de Benoit, who he both singles out for enormous amounts of praise. We don't have to get into them, but probably the one that's attracted the most attention in the Western world is his relationship with Heidegger. He published an interesting long book about Heidegger, where he characterizes him as the greatest Western thinker from whom Russians have the most to learn, largely because in his interpretation, what Heidegger proves is that Western metaphysics and Western ways of looking at things all wind up in a ditch. And therefore, the project has failed and it needs to be restarted. Now, Heidegger, on Dugin's reading, essentially said that Western metaphysics has led to nihilism, and we need a country like Germany which is more spiritually tuned, to restore the West. And Dugin, interestingly enough, just kind of picks up Heidegger's narrative by saying Heidegger is right that Western metaphysics has led to nihilism because it's led to liberalism and led to people watching too many Avengers movies, and we can't have that, right? But, you know, he's wrong to think that Germany, a Western country, was the country of the center that could save world civilization or Western civilization. Really, it's Russia that he never predicted, of course, that is going to be the country that can jumpstart a new, less decadent, more rarefied kind of intellectual and metaphysical project. And consequently, it's the one that will save world civilization, right? So there's this real philosophical messianism, or onto-messianism is probably a better way to put it, that you find in his work. And this has actually been important beyond just for intellectual reasons, because his work on Heidegger has proven really influential on large parts of the American right. Now, whether you take this to be an accurate reading of Heidegger or not, I actually think it's pretty accurate.
I think it's actually right. I mean, one thing I'll say, Matt, is that he keeps on talking about, like, I've been slow reading through for the third time a Fourth Political Theory, like word for word, with a group of people on my channel.
People say I fucking hate myself. You fucking must just be sitting there, like, when your free time, just like fucking bashing yourself on the back.
Well, it's interesting to me because when there was this movement on the left to pick up multipolarism, I, as a former right winger, recognized the moves.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is what they're doing. This is why they're doing it. This is like, Dugin's even tried this before. He tried it in 2011, 2012 with concurrent to Fourth Political Theory. Like, that's not even like, he made forays into the WWP, the formerly Trotskyist intern anti-revisionist party. That's the predecessor to the PSL. Recruited Caleb Maupin to his cohort probably around 2011, 2012. It didn't come out. It wasn't proven for sure till 2015 when Maupin met Dugin at a conference, and then he was kicked out of the WWP and became the fun media figure that we know today. But this was an active strategy, one that he telegraphs, right? In For Political Theory, he talks about, he actually does a thing that is remarkably reminiscent of the fascist, which is to pick up on on George Sorel's use of Marxism as a myth of violence to categorize people. And he actually even ties into the Sorelian reading Frantz Fanon, and all together as a kind of violent reaction of which his group could respond and incorporate and then probably eradicate, quite frankly, Marxist implementations, because he thinks, well, Marxism is a waste of time. The only thing useful about it is a Sorelian myth against the liberal order. That all the productive forces stuff and all that's nonsense to Dugin. Dugin doesn't care about economy. And actually, it's one of the weirdest things about his geopolitics is, even compared to 19th century geopolitics, it doesn't contain a stitch of economics, like, at all. Like, it's not there. Like, does he want, like, even though it's implied in this, like, land thing, the German historical school that was pushing that, like, they did have an economic program. I have no idea what his is, except for maybe, like, autarkist major empires or whatever. The reason why I want people to notice the multipolarity parts of it is that it's just like the metaphor itself is for there to be multiple strong empires. That is what is implicit.
Right. Those are the poles.
Right. The poles. When you compare that to what, say, Lenin said, for example, to Kautsky, I bring this up a lot because a lot of people who will quote Dugin will actually quote this letter thinking that Lenin supports Dugin when Lenin's, like, chastising Kautsky for backing the German situation in the war, which is funny because what Lenin's doing is like, well, you can't and by the way, for those of you who don't know, Kautsky didn't actually support the war effort. He left the SPD after that vote. But he was ambivalent about what socialists should do about it when he was in the independent SPD. And he wrote a letter like, well, maybe it would be good if we at least don't oppose the German war effort because it'll lead to Serbian national liberation, something that even Lenin would be on board with. And Lenin says, yeah, I would be on board with it, except for the fact that it would help the Russian Empire at this moment, or it would help the German one. And we are not to support any imperial project at all.
Yeah, I think that's very important to understand. So one of the things that irritates me about Marxist and liberal evaluations of the political right is, interesting enough, Marxism and liberalism as Enlightenment doctrines both share a kind of rationalism and a kind of economism and materialism, right? And I see across the spectrum, people will try to say, well, fascism is more socialist, or fascism is more capitalist, or ultimately, fascists were motivated by this desire to save capitalism, or fascists were motivated by this desire to implement socialism, but via nationalism, right? Now, what's problematic about all these takes is they very rarely actually look at what fascists themselves have to say about economics. And most fascists, when they talk about economics, see it as dreary materialist decadence that has no place in a kind of viable political outlook. They'll sometimes say things about economics that bricolage different perspectives together. But at the epicenter of their worldview is this idea that economics is a kind of decadent libertine materialism, and it should be subordinate to your political project. And that means that you pretty much implement any economic project or program that you think is appropriate to pursue your grander political objectives.
I mean, fascists in Germany and Italy were certainly propelled to power in large part because powerful interests saw them as a way of preserving capitalism. That's definitely true, but that doesn't mean that it's what got them out of the bed in the morning, right? Like that's a very different claim, right? And like I think I was kind of thinking as Varn was talking earlier about, I'm not a fascist, obviously, but just on the point about Dugin that Richard Nixon famously said something about like not giving a shit about domestic policy. He wanted to be president for, to do all this like high level geopolitics stuff. And he sort of dismissed like all the domestic stuff as like, as he said, like cutting ribbons at shopping malls in Ohio, that like, this is kind of his, like, it's like, yeah, I don't care about that. Right. Like I care about this grand strategy stuff. And, and so I think a lot of the, incoherence in sort of stated economic program that you get in classical fascism and the sort of wild swings from one direction to another. I mean, I think definitely goes with that. And honestly, I think that, you were mentioning Heidegger earlier and actually in your article.
I just want to say, like, Heidegger is an exemplary figure in that respect, right? I mean, his and Dugin picks right up on this, right? His characterization of liberalism or capitalism and socialism was they were metaphysically the same, right? They're both different projects about how you could build a better refrigerator and then debating how best to distribute those refrigerators. Now, I think the debate between capitalism and socialism, or liberalism and socialism, is a lot more robust than that, and there are other more core values that are played than this. But from a fascist perspective, it's all pretty boring and tedious stuff, right? Because it's decadent, materialist, rationalist hogwash, right? And there's usually a fair bit of anti-Semitism that's thrown in there, since fascists then and now aren't afraid of talking about things like Jewish materialism influencing capitalism,
and of course Jews are simultaneously the evil bankers and the dangerous communists.
Judeo-Bolsheviks invented both capitalism and communism, the common conspiracy theory in Germany, which came actually from the Russian whites who were leaving the USSR. But I do want to I do think one of the interesting things that makes dealing with difficult for like fascist spotters is that he doesn't deal with pro-Jewish sentiments like at all. Like it doesn't really come up much. I've read a lot of Dugin. Like I've read at least 5 books, and like I don't see a whole lot of discussion of Israel. If anything, he takes a position kind of like Ghulam Fay as like, well, Israel's great as long as they have their own civilization away from us. The other thing that you would point out, I was going to mention this, and I think it might be relevant, Matt, about his love of Heidegger. He's specifically a defender of the period of Heidegger liberals don't talk about, right? Which he mentions it. He keeps on saying like, well, the best period of Heidegger is from like 1937 to 1942, and I'm like, I wonder why we don't talk about that period of Heidegger at all.
What was Heidegger doing at that point?
Because he was an explicit Nazi at the time.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, Dugin is very fond of a quote Heidegger had when he referred to the United States, where Heidegger referred to the U.S. As the chief proponent of planetary idiocy. And you better believe if you read Dugin's book about Heidegger, he will quote that again and again and again, just tirelessly punishing you with it.
I mean, I also think it is relevant that a lot of contemporary fascism or semi-fascism or post-fascism, isn't actually terribly explicitly anti-Semitic, and actually I think this also connects up to, Varn made the point earlier about Dugin not like enthusing about like street fighting or anything as a sort of mark against the fascism, which it certainly is. But on the other hand, he's also, as was mentioned earlier in the discussion, an explicit supporter of stuff like the Golden Dawn, which certainly includes plenty of street thuggery, So, I think that there's at least a lot of people who, whether or not you think they're exactly still fascist or not, definitely come out of a fascist tradition, like unambiguously so. And, and still have a lot of continuity with that. I think a lot of the things they say on a lot of these topics are very similar to Dugin, but we should watch some Tucker. Jake, do we have the video?
You almost said that with enthusiasm, Ben. It's like,
Yeah,
get Tucker on.
some
Get
Tucker.
on.
Yeah.
I want some Tucker. We haven't got enough Tucker here.
Yeah. Not nearly enough Tucker in all of this. While we're looking for that,
we have it. I'm just glitching out for a second, so we'll have it within a minute.
Okay, so I was just gonna say, while we're looking, what I was gonna bring up about Heidegger is in your Commonweal article, Matt, you quoted this passage from Dugin's book on Heidegger where he so you say echoes the Heideggerian sentiment: the masses are insignificant swarms. I said, so the quote is there, other mountain peaks are clearly visible whereas the insignificant swarms in dark valleys below are indiscernible in the present. Much like long ago, a true thinker knows as little about the details of society in which he lives as he does about those ancient times long gone. Yet the voice of being is audible to him, and it emanates from the ancients clearer and louder than the itching on the part of the senseless masses, both ancient and modern. And I think you go on later to comment that it's easier perhaps to work up all that enthusiasm about sending off conscripts to die in the Donbass, if you're not like that concerned with individual human beings, and you prefer to stay up on the mountain peak.
But they're dying for a glorious cause that he's decided upon, and they should be honored for that.
Yeah,
honored by that. Sorry.
This is an interesting thing about Dugin's thought. Before we get in there, I just want to point this out. He actually talks about we should allow something like human rights for abstract ideas and not for people. This is actually both in the first and second chapters of First Political Theory. Like there's this idea that tradition has a human right as a living thing, of which people are only a part, which is corporatism in both the medieval and the early fascist sense. That you are as but a manifestation of the individual society, civilization, and state, and as such, also the classes have to get along as the various organs of the state, etc., etc., etc. And this is what made fascist ideology somewhat copacetic to anti-liberal conservatives in Italy, who had this like corporatist feudal notion. And Dugin's kind of, playing that up in a way that like you can have your feudalism and not have it at the same time, because obviously the Russian Federation is not actually a feudal society. So it's a very interesting.
Millerman's take on his work is he also tries to define him as a conservative populist, is Millerman's term for him. But even Michael can't whitewash a turd that much. So he says, look, Russia has its own unique view of democracy. Dugin has his own unique view of democracy. But it's not one where the people will actually get to rule. It's one where the special ones or the single ones will rule in the people's name and choose their authentic destiny for them. And the people will then play out that authentic destiny. But it's still democracy because they all participate in it, right?
AKA Bonapartism.
Again. And
so this is this. I just keep on thinking about some like shady guy and like on the street who's trying to sell you something you probably stole, and it's like, it's a little defective. It's like it's better than democracy. Same thing.
Yeah, exactly right. And as we've all been saying, when it comes to the concreteness of Dugin's views, if you want to buy into somebody who's like, just give me a lot of power and I'm going to select a grand destiny for you, and then that winds up with him sending you to die in the Donbass, so that Putin can create a few little governorates on his western border and call that victory. If that appeals to you, then I think that you need to rethink your priorities in life.
Yeah, certainly has nothing, certainly if that appeals to you in the name of anti-imperialism, something somewhere has gone very wrong. But yeah, Jake, let's start this up.
Aleksandr Dugin is a 62-year-old Russian academic philosopher. He spent his life in Moscow. He was an anti-Soviet dissident as a young man. And now he is famous the world over, in the English language press anyway, as, quote, Putin's brain. But he is not a political figure here in Russia. He is, once again, a philosopher. And his ideas are deeply offensive to some people. In August of 2022, his only daughter was murdered in Moscow when a car bomb killed her. U.S. intelligence says she was murdered by the Ukrainian government, and we take that at face value. But what's interesting is that, once again, Aleksandr Dugin is not a military leader. He's not a close daily advisor to Vladimir Putin. He is a writer who writes about big ideas. And for this, his books have been banned by the Biden administration in the United States. You cannot buy them on Amazon. Banning books in the United States because the ideas inside are too dangerous.
I have
He's often described.
Just saying, like, as a ban book, as a book ban goes, it's a pretty shitty book ban if I can have them. I do notice that, like, Arctos Press is a lot harder to buy on Amazon than it used to be, but you can still get it, like, if you want to.
Oh, yeah. I think I downloaded it within about, 5 minutes when I looked at it. There were PDFs all over the place.
I also think, look, I'm, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely we should take corporate censorship more seriously guy, but there's also some slippage there from the Biden administration banned it, to Amazon, removed it. Right. I mean, this is the first formulation makes it sound like, there was a law that, you're not allowed to read Dugin.
Oh, I also want to point out before we begin this, that Tucker isn't the only one to try to brown nose with Dugin. Actually, one of the most obnoxious things I saw when the Russo-Ukraine war began was Jordan Peterson, our good friend of the channel, actually released a long video saying, of course, how Ukrainians probably couldn't win because the Russians felt that they were right because they were waging this war not just against the Ukrainians, but against woke. And he actually singled out Dugin, being like, say whatever you will about what's going on in Russia. They have a real philosopher there, a thinker, you know what I mean? Somebody who's got some dangerous ideas. So he does seem to be making inroads with some people at the upper echelons of the American or the Western right, if you want to call it that. Because they're just willing to buy about anything that he's willing to sell.
Just looking at things right now, I just went to Arctos Press, which ships to America for free. Also, it's very interesting that right now, instead of pushing the rest of the European new right, if you just go to Arctos' Press, every single one of Dugin's book comes up first. The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset, the Eurasian Mission, a new version of Fourth Political Theory with a new cover, Ethnos and Societies, Templars of the Proletariat, Putin versus Putin, which is an interesting book in and of itself. This is like Putin's, Dugin's auto-critique of Putin and push that he's not just a shill for the regime. Ethnosociology, the foundations. I don't know how you can go into ethnosociology and not think that doesn't sound sketchy. The rise of the fourth political theory, political Platonism, the last war, the world island, and talking to the wolf. And then finally you get to archaeofuturism by the late Guillemot Fay. And then you get the philosophy of Italian fascism, esoteric Trumpism, Eratosophy. What else? I mean,
Eratosophy.
Yeah.
Fuck is that?
And then you get fascism viewed from the right and Nazism viewed from the right by Evola, which just tells you where they're going. And then you get into like traditional, normal alt-right stuff like Towards Awakening by Redall, or For a European Awakening, or The Blackening of Europe by Claire Ellis, etc., etc. But when you first come to the website now for Arctos, it's all Dugin all the time. And that's new. That's not like it used to be all Guillemot Fay and de Benoit and the people from Greca. For those of you who don't know, that's that French European New Right collective. So yeah, and the idea that you can't get this in America is just false. Like I can, like I said, I can order all this stuff right now.
Yeah, if the Biden administration told Amazon to remove it, that's bad. They shouldn't be telling Amazon to remove books. But I would say citation needed on that, and also that I think the language of banning is at the least an exaggeration. But yeah, let's go back to this.
Press as far right. We'll let you assess, but we wanted to talk to him about some of his ideas, these ideas that are so dangerous that his only daughter was murdered over them, and his book's been banned in the United States. And so we're happy to have him join us now. Mr. Dugin, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to Moscow.
Of course, thank you. So we were talking off camera. Actually, we were having a conversation that we were not going to film, just interested to meet you. But what you said was so interesting that we got a couple of cameras and put this together. And my question to you is, what do you think is happening in the English language countries? And I said, all of them, United States, Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, all at once decided to seemed to turn against themselves. You know, this great turmoil, and some of the behaviors seem very self-destructive. And where do you think, as an observer, that comes from?
So I could just suggest, express my reading of that. It demands a little patience. So I think that everything started with individualism. So individualism, that was a wrong understanding of the human nature, of the nature of man. When you identify individualism with the man, with the human nature, you cut all the relations to everything else. So you have very special idea of the subject, philosophical subject, as individual. And everything started in the Anglo-Saxon world with Protestant reform and with nominalism. Before that, nominalist attitude that there are no ideas, only things, only individual things. So individual, it was the key, and is still key concept that was put in the center of liberal ideology. And liberalism, as in my reading, it is a kind of historical and cultural and political and philosophical process of liberation of individual, of any kind of collective identity, collective or that transcends individual. And that started with refuse of Catholic Church as collective identity, of empire, Western Empire as collective identity. After that, it was a revolt against a national state as collective identity in favor of purely civil society. After that, there was a big fight of the 20th century between liberalism, communism, and fascism, and liberalism has won once more.
Yes.
So, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was only liberalism, and Francis Fukuyama has pointed out correctly that there are no more any ideologies except of liberalism, and liberalism that was liberation of this individual from any kind of collective identity. There were only two collective identities to liberate from: gender identity, because it is collective identity. You are man or woman collectively, so you could not be alone. So liberation from gender, and that has led to transgenders, to LGBT, and new form of sexual individualism. So sex is something optional. And that was not just deviation of liberalism. That was necessarily elements of implementation and the victory of this liberal ideology. And the last step that is not yet totally made is liberation from human identity, humanity optional. And when now we are choosing, or you in the West, you are choosing the sex you want, as you want. And the last step in this process of liberalism, implementation of liberalism, will mean precisely the human optional. So you can choose your individual identity to be human, not to be human. And that has a name: transhumanism, posthumanism. singularity, artificial intelligence, Klaus Schwab, Kurzweil, or Harari, they openly declare that is inevitable future of humanity. So we arrive to the historical terminal station that we finally, 5 centuries ago, we have embarked in this train, and now we're arriving at the last station. So that is my reading. And when all the elements, all the phases of that, you cut the tradition with the past. So you are no more Protestant, you are secular, atheist, materialist, you are no more nation state that served to liberate from empire, and now national state becomes at its turn obstacle. You are liberating from national state. Finally, family is destroyed in favor of this individualism. And the last things, the sex that is already almost overcome, sex optional, and in gender politics, there is only one step to arrive to the ends of this process of liberation, of liberalism. That is the abandoned human identity as something prescribed. So to be free from to be human, to have the possibility to choose to be or not to be human. And that is the agenda, political, ideological agenda of the tomorrow. That is why how I see Anglo-Saxon world that you have asked of. I think that is just the vanguard of that process, because that started with Anglo-Saxons imperialism, nominalism, Protestantism, and now you are ahead as Anglo-Saxon, more devoted to liberalism than any other European.
So what you're describing is clearly happening.
Let's pause this.
I mean, just not even the ounce of self-reflection there. It's just clearly that's what's happening, right? Obviously.
Well, and it's interesting because I think if you start off with the idea that and by the way, let's talk about where Dugin's getting this. He's actually just saying Francis Fukuyama was right about the nature of liberalism. It's just that he's wrong, that it's going to win, that it appears, and then he traces it back to nominalism. His way he actually defines nominalism is wrong. Frankly, nominalism was the idea that names do not actually represent a relationship to the divine. It was not particularly anti-Catholic. It was the idea that the divine was unexpressible, and anything that we call objects has no relationship to that. So you do have to recontextualize this in a medieval scholastic context, and it has nothing to do with this idea that it's just, there's just the object and it's not connected to anything. Well, no.
Yeah, this is actually the way he described nominalism sounded more like how that word is used in the context of talking about analytic metaphysics, where it's nominalism, as opposed to Platonism about abstract objects. You think that there's no that properties don't exist in some separate way, that there's just they're just sets of concrete objects, right? That is a way I recognize of using the word nominalism, but even if it has nothing to do with his where he's trying to put it in the timeline.
This is, I should say, very common on the political right, though. Not just, I should say, in Russia, but ubiquitously, right? If you want, you can go back to people like Eric Vogelin, for example, who developed a relatively similar critique, arguing that Gnosticism, right, was at the basis of Western decay, precisely because we lost our connection to a kind of Platonic essentialism. Or Peter Lawler, right? Peter Lawler in the United States was a self-described postmodern conservative. You can read his book on postmodern conservatism, and his argument is that modernity is characterized by the ascent of nominalism. This idea that there is no essence to anything, everything is just matter in motion, that can be endlessly manipulated, to produce things that are in human interest, but not necessarily good for humans. But I think that what's interesting about this interview is, as one of our commentators pointed out, just how Dugin really is playing all the hits here, right? Just rolling pretty much everything together to, impress one of the dumbest human beings on the planet, apparently. Or maybe it's true that Jon Stewart is right, and Carlson isn't quite as dumb as his face would have us believe, right? And he's just doing what he needs to do in order to rope in a new job, getting money from the Putin administration. But you see libertarianism, choice, nominalism, materialism, atheism, all these kinds of buzzwords that are very common on the intellectual right, and that give off the impression of intellectually serious thought, even when I'd argue there's not really all that much intellectually serious thought. But if we were to try to kind of reconstruct his mode of thinking, I think there's a pretty clear through line that appears, which is that Dugin is hostile to the idea that people will get to choose what kind of lives they're going to live, because Dugin thinks that people who are the single ones, like himself, or the singular ones, should get to choose for people how they should live, right? And one of the reasons why he's hostile to materialism is, and this goes way back on the political right, is that materialism has a kind of egalitarian quality to that, and it's in that it suggests that we are just animals, right, with certain kinds of biological functions, and ultimately, right, each person's pleasure matters as much as anyone else's, and it's very difficult when you're confronted with such a materialist universe to try to suggest that there are kind of higher order goods that a philosopher has special interest or special access to that other people don't, that everyone else should pursue, and this is one of the reasons why right-wing intellectuals have always drawn this kind of conflation between liberalism and Marxism and materialism, because they suggest that at the core of the kind of nihilistic decline that we see emerging in the world is precisely this insistence that we're just matter and motion, and that each human animal's interests are as important as anyone else's, because they want people to be committed to what they take to be these more grand projects that are elevating in a certain kind of way. But there's a clearly elitist dimension to this, because, of course, only certain kinds of people will have the proper sense of what these grand projects are going to be, which means that you can't align yourself with a political project like democracy that will allow ordinary people too much choice in who their leaders are going to be, or too much choice in how their life is going to go, because then they're probably not going to elect to participate in your grand projects, which is why you can't allow them that kind of power.
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff about materialism is like pretty standard issue right-wing thought. The thing that, from a perspective of mostly paying attention to North American right-wingers, strikes me as fun and different here, is that like how much of the blame he seems to be laying on Protestantism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, I mean, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, right, that's relatively new for me. Maybe Derek will point out if he's made those kind of gestures before. I mean, I've seen references to the corrosive effect of Protestantism in his work before, but this kind of quasi gesture or olive branch to Catholicism and suggesting that the decline of Catholicism in the Western world was a bad thing, that's something I haven't seen before.
Well, this is an interesting thing. It's not just the decline of Catholicism, it's the westernization of Catholicism, which leads to Protestantism, which he sees as manifested in the Anglo-American world. But if you're used to Orthodox Christian apologetics, it's actually, this is not a new claim. I've seen this stuff about nominalism being the beginning, because there is a theological Platonism in Orthodox Christianity, because it's tied to the Greek East, that is not there in like Western scholastic stuff. So he's the decline of Protestantism, I mean the decline of Catholicism for him, it might not go back to the Great Schism, but it definitely goes back to at least Aquinas, and then also medieval nominalist and substantivist debates, which they didn't have in the Greek church. Those never happened there, and thus they didn't happen in the Russian church either, because they were tied into the Roman church, the Byzantine church. So this is not just a polemic against Protestants, it's a polemic against Western Christianity. One thing a right-wingish friend of mine pointed out is, if as you go through Dugin in time, the move from a racial subject, which is what you see in very early Dugin before his books come up, before even the Foundations of Geopolitics, like when he was out hanging out with Lemanoff in his coffee house fascist days, to a religious notion of nation is very much a progression over the past 20 years. So like he picks up more stuff that you hear from, like, if you've been around Rokor, which is the more are the descendant of Rokor, which is the more the Russian Orthodox Church in America that's actually like kind of not in communion anymore with the rest of the Orthodox communions because of partly because of stuff over Ukraine. But also because Rokor was like in rebellion against the Orthodox Church in Russia during the Soviet Union, and so that's where like a lot of the anti-communists head out. These talking points were developed there, actually, in the Russian diaspora community in America, kind of first before you hear them in Dugin. So again, Matt, you're right. You just have this barrage of different reactionary talking points.
Yeah.
And if you're in the Tucker world, he's blaming the nominalist and not like Western Christianity as a whole, because like, well, maybe there is a Western Christianity worth saving. It's just prior to Thomas Aquinas, and you know, maybe it's post-schism, but it's still like 700 years ago.
Well,
so
this is what I want to say, right? A lot of people get hung up on this fascination with nominalism. And as Derek pointed out, their discussion of these debates, unless you're Vogelin, who actually was pretty sophisticated on this, tends to be pretty crude. But at the core of their rejection of so-called nominalism is this attraction to an idea of essentialism, right? This idea in a kind of crude Aristotelian or crude Platonic fashion that everything has its place in the cosmic order, and as long as everything stays in its place, things will go well and they won't decay. And the problem with liberalism or materialism or communism is precisely by suggesting that there isn't an essence to everything, is that it denies this idea that everything has its place within society or within the cosmic hierarchy or within the world hierarchy. And it's up for individuals to choose who they want to be. And individuals should be equally free to choose where they want to be or what they want to do. And that's something that pretty much everybody on the right has always been highly allergic to. They're just not usually as militant about it as people on the far right. And so this attraction to this idea of essentialism or anti-nominalism is really this kind of yearning to return to a stratified vision of society where there will be a kind of unified order because everybody will understand who they are supposed to be, where they are supposed to be, and they won't question that all that substantially. Now, I want to be clear, what makes Dugin interesting is how, again, he's extraordinarily inconsistent on these points because other days he's not afraid to appeal to Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault and suggest that universalism of the sort that liberal political theorists would think was so important is absolutely inappropriate, right? Instead, we need to accept that each country or each narod or people has its own unique destiny, its own unique identity, and it's imperialist to suggest that there's a kind of moral project or shared identity that one could impose or expect of them. And then he'll use all kinds of post-structuralist and postmodernist techniques to try to unravel that. Or, of course, we could even point to Heidegger, right, who himself was an anti-essentialist in many respects and anti-Aristotelian. And so this just goes to show you again how Dugin is not really all that concerned with the intellectual consistency of his project, so much as he's concerned with hitting the right buttons for people on the right, partly depending on who his audience is, to get them riled up to buy in to what is ultimately his political aspiration, which is to restore this Russian empire and to crush liberalism, which is the one constant through line in all of his work. Liberalism is bad, America bad, Russia good. At least Russia understood the right way, and we'll say whatever we need to do, we need to say in order to get rid of them.
Yeah, I remember a couple times ago when Zizek was on, he made the same point that like Dugin will sort of do the, you know, cheesy postmodern relativism sometimes, right? Oh, we have our own, you know, we have our own Russian truth, and you know that's totally different from, you know, your Western, you know, values. Everybody just gets to do their own thing, but like it's like, yeah, sometimes, and then sometimes it's that these are like satanic perverts who want to make everybody trans and then want to force everybody to upload to a computer.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, America doesn't get to have its own special truth because America is the land of planetary idiocy and nihilism, right? And its influence needs to be abetted. Whereas Russia is, a more spiritual country and less decadent, so it has a major role to play in world affairs. And again, there's an enormous amount of intellectual inconsistency in his work, but I don't think that pointing that out has ever really hurt the guy all that much, because I don't think that what he's selling is really intellectual consistency for its own sake.
Nope.
What he's selling is a project that is meant to, as Derek pointed out, I think very effectively, rope in a lot of different people, including some on the left, if he can convince them, and convince them that their goals can be achieved if the United States and liberalism are destroyed. And he'll say what he needs to in order to get people to buy in on that, depending upon who he's talking to or what audience he thinks he's pitching to. If he's writing the fourth political theory, then all of a sudden he'll start then talking about post-structuralism and all the good things about that. Apparently now, if he's talking to somebody like Tucker Carlson, who's an American conservative, he'll start aping the language of Christianity and Catholicism of a certain sort in order to try to make the case that there's something anti-Christian about this. So strategic guy, there's no doubt about it. It's just very, very hard for me not to be contemptuous of somebody who so lacks intellectual and moral integrity that he's just willing to say whatever kind of bullshit he needs to in order to get what he wants. Because for somebody who claims to be a Heideggerian or a Platonist, I can't think of any greater sin than that.
Yeah, well, also claiming to be both a Heideggerian and a Platonist is a crazy assertion in and of itself. But I mean, like there's an if you read Fourth Political Theory, there's an anti-essentialism in the book where he talks about like embracing the Dasein. So every nation chooses to embrace itself. This is a Heideggerian thing where like ultimately the nation is self-constructed. Once you construct the nation, your will subordinate to it, but it's your authenticity that ties you to it, whatever, throw Adorno's jargon of authenticity at that book's face. Nonetheless, that's what it is. It's like you by choosing to build the German nation are subordinating yourself to its spirit, but it's still an existential, non-essential choice you made for Heidegger. And for political theory, Dugin really 2 whole chapters are devoted to that. When you read Political Platonism, or what he's saying here, it's talking about the essence of nations and their national essences and national characters in a way that's much more similar to, say, de Maistre, who talks about this. Like, well, God broke up humanity, so I've never met a human. I met a German, I met a Frenchman, etc. So, and this tension I want to like point out is universal on the Christian right. One of the things that makes Dugin kind of interesting is he loves Alain de Benoit. Alain de Benoit rejects Christianity as a universalizing project. That's explicit. He wrote the book on paganism for that reason. Whereas for Dugin, Christianity is fundamentally part of his project because it's part of what makes Russia superior. So how do you reconcile that? Now, he claims not to have like a universalizing Christian mission because he's totally okay with Islamism, which you just come to believe is like, this man is either he's convinced himself of truths that are fundamentally at odds with each other and is deliberately not looking at them because it would cause his ideology to fall apart, or you can't believe a word he says. Like,
this has always been my view of far-right intellectuals, and I've actually seen some people expressly say this, right? For every intellectual contradicts himself at some point, right? Especially if you write enough. I'm sure if I were to scour Ben's books, I'd find contradictions in them. I'm sure if I were to scour one of my books, there'd probably be some points where I say contradictory things. But what's interesting about the far right is how most of us who belong to the tradition of, let's call it Western rationalism, see contradiction as something to be avoided, or if you're a certain kind of Hegelian, to be sublated, right? But one way or another, it's problematic and it has to be thought through. The far right is much more willing to embrace contradiction as a sign of profundity, right? To almost bastardize that old Walt Whitman quote, do I contradict myself? Well, I contain multiplicities within myself. And the problem with that, of course, is their contradictions aren't expressive of some deep profundity on their part or a real insight into the way the world works that the rest of us don't have. It's a symptom of the fact that they'll just say, as Derek pointed out, anything that they fucking want at any given time in order to obtain their objectives. And if somebody calls them out on it later on, then they'll just switch gears and go to another motif. and Dugin is very skilled at that.
Well, I will say he's not going to get called out in anything right now because he just, if there are two things that are beloved to North American conservatives, it's Protestantism and Great Britain, and Dugin just blamed both of them for the coming trans singularity, and Tucker just wow. So
I wonder about
he's
that,
right about
though.
everything.
I wonder about that though, because Ben, because we've seen this shift in the Protestant world, and someone like Ron Dreyer, from Protestant to Catholic, from Catholic to Eastern Orthodox, from Eastern Orthodox to fucking wreck. That we see in a lot of these people. I mean, evangelical Christianity is notably on the decline, which is why Christian nationalism is so virulent right now. It's not because it's ascendant, it's because it's descendant and in a defensive posture. When Christian nationalism is ascendant, like in the 70s and 80s, it doesn't call itself that. Right. And so it just calls itself good old Americanism. So I guess there is sort of like a desperate pleading on the right now for something, and I guess asking people to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, which a lot of like alt-right people actually did in the aughts, even though they got deemed, just to defend Orthodox Christians a little bit, they got deemed as being heretics because racism is a heresy in the Orthodox Church, ironically. So a lot of them got excommunicated, but nonetheless, this idea also of like national churches is kind of a way out of the whole like Christian universal mission of the Catholic Church. But Dugin can't say that to Tucker, because if you alienate the Catholics too, you got nothing. Like,
yeah, especially on the American right today. Yeah, I think that's
I think it's a good point about Christian nationalism. I mean, this is like, you think about the difference between like I don't know, like the 80s and 90s when, Pat Robertson could make like quasi plausible runs for president, or like come in second in Iowa or whatever. And now, I mean, it's like, it does kind of mirror the way that like leftists are much more willing to like gravitate towards the silliest shit that they could say, like when they feel the most exiled from real power.
We would never do that. That was dark, man. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of like speak a little bit to his popularity here, I think there are a few different reasons why Dugin is appealing to the American or the Anglo right at this moment, right? I think part of the reason is that conservative revolutionary thinkers, quite disturbingly, and fascist thinkers are enjoying a renaissance on the American right today. That's true if you look at Heidegger, it's true if you look at Schmidt, it's true if you look at Spengler, it's true if you look at, I even saw people, saying nice things about Storm of Steel the other day, right? And I was like, oh, great. So we're back here again. And Dugin hits a lot of
part of Ernst Jünger, not even the good stuff. Like,
yeah,
go ahead.
Exactly. And Dugin hits a lot of the same buttons, has a lot of the same inspirations, and is part of, in many ways, the same intellectual tradition, or at least he likes to situate himself as such. So he's enjoying a moment then for that reason. But I think for the average person on the right who isn't going to be flipping through the Storm of Steel, I think his appeal is a lot more visceral, and it's that the way that Russia is presented by its apologists like Tucker is as a kind of anti-woke conservative utopia where there's a strong man in charge who is not willing to take any kind of bullshit, who pushes back against liberalism when liberalism gets a little bit uppity, and of course, this is where my socialism comes in. Russia also has the benefit of being a nation state that is ultimately ruled by plutocrats, and they don't look like they're going anywhere. So there's a lot of things to like about Russia for people on the American right, and it should be no surprise that somebody who has very skillfully marketed himself as Putin's brain, as Dugin has, and like Derek, I'm not sure if he does actually have an influence on Putin. I lean towards the school of thought that sees Putin as mostly using Dugin as a kind of useful voice when he needs him, and shuffles him aside when he doesn't think so. But Dugin has presented himself this way. Russia is very popular on the American right now, so he's also enjoying a moment in the sun for that reason.
Yeah,
that pisses me off.
Yeah, fine.
No, I just finished. I mean, that just pisses me off, right? Because I'm like, of all the countries in the world that you'd want to emulate, a autocratic nationalist state with a GDP smaller than Canada's isn't one that I would immediately look to. But I guess the American right just has such shitty taste right now that they'll fucking reach for anything.
I mean, I think there's a certain innate conflict there, because if you want to be like, on the one hand, there are, as you say, all these things there to like from a right-wing perspective, but on the other hand, you want to be an American jingoist. So how do you reconcile that? So Tucker, for example, reconciles it by saying that we should in fact de-escalate with Russia, so we can ally with Russia, and we can do what we really need to do, which is crush China. So it's a nice way of mirroring those two impulses. But let's go back to it.
But it's not the definition of liberalism I have in mind when I describe myself as what we say in the United States as a classical liberal. So you think of liberalism as individual freedom and choice from slavery, right? So the options as we conceive them as I was growing up were the individual who can follow his conscience, say what he thinks, defend himself against the state, versus the statism, the totalitarianism embodied in the government that you fought against, the Soviet government. And I think most Americans think of it that way. What's the difference?
Very interesting question. I think that is the problem is in two definitions of liberalism. There is old liberalism, classical liberalism,
yes,
and new liberalism. So classical liberalism was in favor of democracy. Democracy understood as the power of majority, of consensus, of individual freedom that should be combined somehow with the freedom of other. And now we have totally the next station already, next phase, new liberalism. Now it is not about the rule of majority, but it is about the rule of minorities. It is not about individual freedom, but it is about wokeism. So you should be really so individualistic that you should criticize not only the state, but individual, the old understanding of individual. So you are invited to liberate yourself from individuality, to go further in that direction. So I have spoken once with Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama, on TV, and he has said before, democracy has meant the rule of majority, and now it is about the rule of minorities against majority, because majority could choose Hitler or Putin. So we need to be very careful with majority, and majority should be taken under control, and minorities should rule over majority. Majority, it is not democracy, it's already totalitarianism. And now we are not about defense of the individual freedom, but about prescription to be woke, to be modern, to be progressive. It is not your right to be or not to be progressive. It is your duty to be progressive, to follow this agenda. So you are free to be a left liberal. You are no more is free enough to be right liberal. You should be left liberal, and that is a kind of duty. It is prescription. So liberalism fought during its history against any kind of prescription, and now it at its turn became totalitarian, prescriptive, not free as it was in some.
And do you believe that was inevitable? That process that was always going to happen?
I think that is, I perceive here a kind of logic. So a kind of logic that is not just perversion or deviation. You start with one thing, you want to liberate individual. When you arrive at the point when it is possible, it is realized, so you need to go further. So, and you start to liberate ourselves from this time from old understanding of individual in favor of more progressive concepts. So you could not stop here. That is my vision. So if you say, "Oh, I prefer old liberalism," they would say, the progressives, they would say, it is not about old liberalism, it is about